talking about GIS, which you've probably heard enough by now, so that shouldn't come as a surprise. I'm Sarah Geinosky. I'm a GIS analyst. I work at NERPC. So what is NERPC? We're the Northwestern Indiana Regional Planning Commission, and our job is to be both a council of governments and a metropolitan planning organization. And the reason why I'm going to take some time to tell you what this means is that if you're interested in transportation funding especially, so you think we need more sidewalks on that road, or you're really curious about why we don't have a bus route down that street, NERPC can help. And I don't know if you saw it there, there's a map out there for the greenways, blueways. That's something NERPC does, for example. So we take a lot of that federal money that gets appropriated in transportation bills and then dole it out to communities based on a regional plan that's reached by consensus. So we had this great 2040 plan. We're about to start the 2050 plan, so keep your eyes peeled. We'd really love people to get involved. So our goal was to engage the region, and our main concerns are growth and conservation, transportation, environment, human and economic resources, and stewardship and governance. So now that you know a little bit about what we do, you probably get an idea. As a GIS person, my job is to make maps and to take geographic data, which ends up being really important when it comes to planning. So what is GIS? It stands for Geographic Information Systems, and what we're talking about is spatial data. So what's spatial data when we talk about that? This is a list of some of my favorite restaurants in Northwest Indiana. A couple of them aren't there anymore, and that makes me very sad, but I'm going to keep this up as a requiem to their greatness. So as you can see, though, there's spatial information. So there's not just a name, but you can see where they're located. And that, you know, it's in space. So have everything pretty much, especially when you're dealing with demographics or the location of hospitals, for example, they have a certain place that they are taking up. So this is a map of Northwest Indiana. And those green dots are locations of some of my favorite restaurants. Now that you see that, though, you can see that my favorite restaurants have categories. So I can qualify whether or not they're a barbecue place or a cafe. And when we map that, we can use different colors to show where they're located. And maybe there's a connection between them. I can't really see a connection there, so sometimes there's not a connection between location and specifically what you're looking for, but at least you can visualize this sort of information. And then I can quantify how good those restaurants are. So on a scale from 1 to 5, and nobody got a 1 because they're my favorite restaurants, so I already really like them, I gave them a score. And using that score, I can then tell you where those restaurants are and how much I like them. Now that seems like kind of a silly example, but it's a good way to explain this is what this is at the most basic level. And so GIS kind of dates back to all the first mapping, which has been happening forever. The first known maps used to answer spatial questions were these cholera maps that seriously, everybody who ever learns GIS has to look at this map. So these are locations of where there were a lot of cholera deaths occurring in London, I think, and also locations of where there were different wells. They could figure out which wells were contaminated. And now that and when people figured out you can do this, they're like, well, we can answer all these questions by just showing things on top of each other. So computer systems made a huge impact on this, obviously, because before we had to sit down and trace everything, and it was really, really annoying. And as well as GPS. So now I can go on with my phone. I don't even need sophisticated equipment. I just can use a cheap $50 phone, and I can tell you where I'm at, and I can record that location. And that's really powerful. So today, GIS can be used on your personal computer. It can be used on your phone. It can be used on fancy supercomputers that take up more space in this library. You often use things like GIS in Google Maps, for example. That'll tell you where things are located Often there's certain information layered on top of each other. You get things like directions. That requires spatial data for the computer to figure out where things are going. And in general, you can see things, you still use it for tracking disease. So you ever been on the CDC website, for example, they'll tell you what, where's all the flu cases occurring by state. That's GIS. And at this moment, we use GIS in everything. We just don't really know it. So you see it in engineering, planning, that's us, management, transportation, insurance, telecommunications, business. So for example, a lot of companies take information on the different demographics of an area and realize, well, we want to send our advertisements to these homes because they fit the demographics of people we want to sell to. And so from social work, GIS has some really big benefits that aren't always realized, and that's why we're doing a class like this so that you guys know and you can bring this into your own work and really proliferate this because it's really, really important. So you can take things like demographics, for example. So this is the percent minorities based on the 2010 census. So the darker red includes a more significant percentage of minorities within that census tract than the lighter pink. And then I think white is less than, or is about 0% or less. So that's really significant. You can see where those trends are. But you can also map things like service providers. So for example, you can map hospitals. So these are the hospitals in Northwest Indiana. And okay, so I can go on Google Maps and I can Google hospitals, and I can go on the census website and Google some basic demographic information. This is where it gets cool. You can put these things together. So, for example, now we can see correlation between percentage minority and hospital locations. And in some situations, again, there isn't always going to be a connection per se. But you can say, wow, there's a really significant, there aren't a lot of hospitals in Gary, but there's a really significant concentration of minority populations. Well, maybe we need a hospital. Or at least makes it easier to make that case. So when we're talking about GIS, there's a couple words that are going to come up a little bit during this conversation. So the first one's layer. So think of it like the layer of an onion or the layer of a salad or any sort of layer. So for example, if you have that demographics information, that's one layer. The hospitals, that's another layer. And then one type of layer is a base map. And so when you use Google Maps, for example, that entire base of those maps, that's your base map. And it sounds confusing, but base maps are pretty much pre-made GIS maps that make it really helpful to understand the references you're using. So we'll look at some examples later today of what those are. But for example, you could be looking at aerial photos of your area or just where are the roads. And then a legend will tell you what's going on in the map. And so when you need to, like when we were talking earlier about so for example, this is your legend. This is how I know how to read what's going on here. Okay, so we're not actually going to use desktop GIS today because we've done this in the past and people take years of their life to learn how to use this. It's not actually that hard to necessarily get your foot in the door, but it's kind of hard to do it in like a 2-hour period. So we're not going to do it tonight. But if you manage to like what we're doing tonight and you are computer savvy or computer interested or you just want to know more, I highly recommend these computers have access to a software called ESRI ArcGIS. And it's a lot more powerful than what we're going to show you tonight, but it's also just a little bit steeper of a learning curve. So for example, with desktop, you can take all this data. You don't necessarily need to use data that is pre-provided. You can download data. and manipulate it. And this is the software specifically that's used everywhere. But it's important to keep in mind that if you don't want to pay for it, and you might not you might not have to. I think ESRI provides a free license if it's for your own personal use. But there are free versions. And I'm going to tell you that because not enough people use those, and ESRI gets to take over the market, and it makes everybody's life harder. So do use the free versions if you're interested. Okay, so we talked about Google Maps before. Specifically, Google My Maps is like a step up from Google Maps. So if you've got a Google account, and that means Gmail, maybe use Google Drive, maybe for some other reason you have signed up to Google. Maybe, is Google Plus still a thing? They had a social network at some point. I think that's still a thing somewhere. So maybe you have one of those accounts. If you have a Google account and you can just sign up for one, you can make your own maps based on Google Maps. So you could add map points, lines, polygons, and you can draw these things. So if you know what area you're working in, you can put in directions because that's what Google Maps is really good at. You can import an Excel table. So for example, we saw that Excel table from earlier of my favorite restaurants. That's the example of something you could import. You could stylize things, make them look nice. Like we said before, you can say, well, I want these restaurants of this type to look this color and these restaurants to look this color. And then you can export that data to use it in other platforms. And then you can print and save and print. One of the things we're going to use today, but we'll get a chance to really look at it more later, is called ArcGIS Online. So this is based on the desktop software that I talked about earlier. But this one's a little easier to use. Also, it's free. You can do it online. It makes it a lot easier to kind of get your foot in the door. But this one you can use to explore different data sets, and we'll show you how to do that. You can turn layers on and off. You can move positions of those layers. You can change your base maps. You can click on elements for more information. You can add your own shapes. You can measure distance. And then you can print the maps, or you can save them as PDF or JPEGs or something like that. And then you can add your own data if you have your own data. Or you can save your map and come back to it. So one thing, we talked about that Excel sheet before. If you have an Excel sheet, you can save it as a comma-separated value table. And that at some point today, if you have your own Excel sheet, I'd be happy to show you how to do that. Because sometimes with these softwares, it's just easier to upload it like this. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, then we'll figure it out later. Because it's just one of those weird quirks of the software. But it's pretty easy to understand. And then indianamap.org is the second thing we're going to go through today. So this one kind of does some of the same things, except this is all about Indiana. So nobody here is doing a project outside of Indiana, are they? Okay, good. I don't know why not, but hey, that's good. You can look at a lot of different layers. One of the cool things about Indiana Map, and we'll go over this when we're looking at it, is that this is information that's put together by IU Bloomington, so you know it's good. You know that they've said it's good. You don't have to think critically about, well, I don't know if I can trust this data because, I mean, you're IU students, right? Like, you trust them. Then you can do similar things. So you can change base maps. You can move positions of layers. You could add your own shapes. You can print your map, just like we talked about before, so that you'll be able to have a map at the end of today. And then you can download data and be able to use it in different formats. So we were talking before how you can upload data on some of those things. Indiana Map is a really great place to download that data. Okay, so that's kind of my early spiel about GIS. I was wondering if anybody has any questions so far. Okay. Yes?
With these programs, does it break it down by city, or do you kind of like just got to know where the cities are on the map?
So depending on what you're doing, or like what program you're using and what the data looks like, it could be by city, or it could be by some other unit. A lot of times, like the census, for example, aggregates data by census tract or census block or census block group. Mostly you will be seeing those other ones, but like they also aggregate by place, so like a municipality. So the answer is sometimes. But you should be able, you'll know. And then in some of these programs, you might have to do a little like knowledge hunting, and we'll show you how to do that. But if it's something, for example, a census tract is smaller than a place, so that might be a better source for you if you're saying, well, this side of the city has this need. But hopefully that'll make sense when we're looking at it.
Okay.
Question?
I guess like the demographic data, is that like updated once a year? Like when you take them from maps and stuff like that, like the minority percentage?
It depends on, I guess, the data. So the U.S. Census is probably your best place to get demographic data. And the U.S. Census they have a lot of products, but the two products that you're most likely to come in contact with are the decennial census, which comes out every 10 years. That's the one that, you get the form, you got to fill it out, send it back. Everybody has to do that. So the decennial census is the gold standard of demographic data because the most people get counted, but it only comes out every 10 years. So in the meantime, the census sends out these really long forms called the American Community Survey. Has anybody ever gotten one of these? They're really long. You may have gotten one and been like, I'm not doing this, because they're really long. But they ask all these questions. So not only do they count people, they count things like, I'm trying to think of a good, educational attainment, or how many people are in the household based on household like leader type, and what do people do for a living, and where do they work, and how long is their commute time. And it's really detailed information, but they don't send that every 10 years because nobody would answer, not enough people would answer it. However, they send that every year, but they aggregate it over 5 years because, again, not enough people answer it to get a good sample size. So the answer to that is also, it depends. Something like minority percent could be easily calculatable with that American Community Survey data, or it might make sense to stick with the 2010 numbers for the next 5 years. It really comes down to, it's a judgment call because I can trust the 2010 numbers better. There's less of a margin of error. There's less, more people got counted in the first place. But on the other hand, some really big change may have occurred in the last 5 years that I really would want to capture. So it's worth taking that, the unsureness out of it. Or like you're willing to deal with that. Like, I'm not 100% sure about this because I'm showing a really important trend still. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions?
Can you
Yes.
give a specific example of how GIS has been used in a social work setting?
A specific example?
Or a type of use?
So, for example, you could, if you're interested in something like promoting affordable housing, for example, there's a lot of databases online, for example, that will show you, I'm trying to think of I might be able to pull something up real quick. So let me. So for example, this map right here would show, if we go to, where are you, Lake County? No. So for example, there are 34 affordable units for every 100 renter households. So, and then you can compare that to other communities nearby, like for example, Cook County, it's only 25%. And then you could take this information and say, well, we really need to work on creating programs that promote affordable housing. And that's more of a policy decision, but if you have that sort of information gathered, and you can probably find this data at a much smaller place unit, then you could use it to make a case for that policy decision. So whether or not that's talking to your municipal leaders or downstate or calling your congressman, you know, having that data makes it easier to make that case.